Okay, there is something really interesting about this record that I just discovered recently, and I never thought about it before. There's something really cool that makes this record so unique and so special to so many people back in 1990 that never crossed my mind before, but now that I think about it, it seems so obvious. So today we're going to talk about Serious Hits Live, the live album that came out in 1990 after the But Serious tour. And so we're going to talk all about it. We're going to go track by track. This is an incredible album. It's very nostalgic for me. And there's something really interesting that I discovered about this record. After doing a little bit of research on this record, there's something that makes this album super special back in the 90s. And it's something I never thought about before, but now when you think about it, it's completely obvious. I've got this all unfolded and I can't figure out how it goes back together. Goodness. Okay. Little kind of an accordion. I got it. Here it is on cassette, which are easy to find, right? These are easy to find because it sold 9 million copies. On CD, also very easy to find. Look at that. Like some of them have that kind of grayish color, and then some of them have the peachy color. And I actually believe I have this on DVD. Here it is on DVD, and see it's like more purpley, kind of like this was like a reissue they did in 2003. So this is the DVD version of that, of the Berlin show, which we'll talk about how that differs from the album. Then this is the original vinyl that would have come out in 1990. And this is a double disc vinyl, and it's really nice. I've talked about on another video that I did about vinyl, there's some actually skipping issues that are on this version and on the 2016 version. I believe this was maybe even 2018. 2019 when they redid this and Nick Davis remastered it, although I don't really hear a huge difference on this version, and also on Hot Night in Paris, which we've done a review on as well. I actually found this on Amazon used, obviously, for about $30, which I thought was a steal because of like the early 90s, vinyl wasn't as popular as cassettes, and so it's harder to find this in the same way that it's the album that came out 2 years later. And the album that came out a year later, We Can't Dance, and The Way We Walk live album, those records are hard to find on vinyl as well. So this is quite hard to find. If you do find it, I saw it in a record shop just recently for $100. So I got it for 30. I was really happy back in 2018. And then like a couple months later, they came out with the reissue. So I bought the reissue as well. I have the VHS of this live in Berlin. I had it. I don't know if I still have it. I'll have to look for it. I also had a tour t-shirt. I was at this show, not in Berlin, but I was at it in Toronto in 1990, I believe it was, in June, I think. So for a lot of reasons, this record is really, really important to me. But I'll tell you why it's actually important to a lot of people in the 90s and why it sold so well. And it actually became a perennial seller for Phil up until his greatest hits package came out in, I believe, 1998, the hits, because Tarzan was 99, I think. Why did Serious Hits sell so well? Why was it such a popular record? Does anybody know why? Take a guess. I already gave you a clue. Greatest Hits album came out in 98. This was his first greatest hits album. That's why. If you were a Phil Collins fan, even just a passive fan in 1990, and you wanted to hear his biggest songs, what were his biggest songs? Against All Odds, Groovy Kind of Love, Two Hearts, Easy Lover, Separate Lives. If you wanted to hear those songs, they weren't on an album. You couldn't just go to Spotify and listen to them. So in order to hear Separate Lives, you would have to go and maybe find the single, the 7-inch or the 12-inch single. If they did a CD single back then or a cassette single, maybe you'd have to catch it on the radio. Same with Easy Lover. You'd have to buy Philip Bailey's record. Or if you wanted, you'd have to own Buster. And that's why a lot of people own the Buster on CD and cassette if they wanted to hear Two Hearts and A Groovy Kind of Love. Same with Against All Odds. And so really, if you wanted to hear all of those big, big songs, plus Another Day in Paradise, plus Sussudio, One More Night, In the Air Tonight, then this was the best vehicle to do it. And Phil was at his absolute peak in 1990. No Jacket Required was massive. Then Invisible Touch was massive. And then But Seriously was way more massive than all of those. And so by the time this came out, his hits were so popular. And this was essentially a greatest hits record. This was the only way to hear a greatest hits record. Actually, it's really funny. As a Canadian, I was trying to think of another example of a band that didn't have a greatest hits album, and so that their live album essentially became a greatest hits album. I suppose in a way you could say that about Seconds Out, but an album that comes to mind is by a Canadian band called the Barenaked Ladies. And in the late 90s, they came out with a CD called Rock Spectacle, which ironically looks a lot like this artwork. And it was essentially their greatest hits. And I had a copy of that as well. And so it was really interesting that if you wanted all of Phil's hits in one collection, this was the only way to get it for another 7 or 8 years until he came out with his proper greatest hits record. Let's talk real quick about the packaging. So we've got this like carousel look, right? Because the carousel, for some reason, he's this ringmaster. I don't know the origins of that because that doesn't equate with But Seriously and any of the themes on But Seriously. So for the Sirius tour, having, this circus vibe with the carousel in the middle and all of the guys dressed up here, and they weren't dressed up on stage. So that, to me, that doesn't really equate. I'm not really sure where that came from. It's cool though. And it gave the whole tour a theme. He wouldn't really do that too much. I mean, there was a cool elaborate set for the Both Sides tour, but he didn't really carry through that theme very much. Same with Live and Loose, the Dance into the Light tour. It was obviously very like tropical and Afro influenced and stuff, but he had this theme on all the merchandise. In fact, I had a poster from the show in my room when I was in grade 3. How crazy is that? You are a nerd. I will say it does have that skeuomorphic design that Phil loves so much that he did that they're doing on the BBC box set with Genesis, for example, that makes it kind of look like an old collection of photos and stuff. And there's another example I just stumbled across. I'm not sure if it's it could be the One More Night single, but he does this kind of like faked distressed look a lot in his career. And it's okay. I don't mind it. Recording quality is great. No complaints about that. Let's talk about this album. We're going to go song by song in a second, real quick. But let's talk about the difference between this album and the entire show. And so if you have a copy of the DVD or you can watch it on YouTube, then the set list is way longer. There's way more deep cuts too, right? We have Inside Out. We have Hand in Hand. We have The West Side, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. There's like the ballad version of Doesn't Anybody Stay Together Anymore. I want to watch this again. Now that I'm talking about it, I just love that show. I love how he opens with Hand in Hand. Then he comes out after, the crowd's cheering. Germany's going crazy. Massive, massive outdoor audience. And then some guy, I was curious who this guy is. I got to get him on the show. But that guy who comes out holding a mirror in a suit jacket and gives the suit jacket to Phil, and Phil combs his hair. I always thought, as a kid, I always thought that was hilarious. This record is so nostalgic for me because I think as a kid, even though I liked Face Value, even though I liked Hello, I Must Be Going, it had a lot of filler for as a kid. As a kid, you're looking for the hits. You're looking for Sue Studio. You're looking for You Can't Hurry Love or In the Air Tonight or I Missed Again. And so having something like this that's just giving me Who Said I Would, Don't Lose My Number, Sue Studio, Take Me Home, all the big songs without any of those, The Roof is Leaking or Through These Walls, which would be inappropriate for a kid anyway to be listening to. So without any of those kind of like darker, deep cuts, as a kid, I really liked having this because it was a greatest hits package. And I didn't realize that. Being such a fan of this record, now I'm a fan of the deep cuts of Phil, so I don't really listen to this record as much as I did when I was a kid. But as a kid and a teenager, I never really realized, and even as an older fan, I never realized how this was just a greatest hits album for people. But we're talking about the difference between the full show. And so I recently downloaded a bootleg of his Madison Square Garden show, which is, I think, the last show on this tour. They had played over 100 dates. And they ended it with a couple nights at Madison Square Gardens in New York. It's a fantastic show. The quality on this bootleg is really good because it was recorded, it was aired live on FM radio. And so it sounds really, really good. And so many songs, right? Just so many songs. I think Always is on there. Same with on the DVD as the penultimate track before Take Me Home. The band introductions as well. Band introductions, is that on here? Yep, band introductions is on here as well. So a really, really long show. So I think what a lot of people don't love about Sirius Hits, in the same way you could say it about The Way We Walk as well, and definitely about Three Sides Live, is that they just handpicked the best songs. We know that this record here, Sirius Hits Live, is handpicked, right? So all throughout his tour, probably just the US dates, like as the band had gotten on and gotten a little bit better. We know that Take Me Home is live in Chicago because at the very end he says, "Thank you, Chicago." So I think basically I guess they're listening to board mixes of some of this and finding out the best versions of each song. That's kind of my guess of how it happened. Whereas with this, it's just a very energetic show in Berlin, and whatever warts and mistakes happen on that tour or at that specific show is included in here, probably edited out. They always edit the music a bit. But I think, well, obviously one of the downfalls of Serious Hits live is the fact that we're missing Hand in Hand. We're missing that cool version of Doesn't Anybody Stay Together Anymore. We're missing the band introductions, some of the deeper cuts, like Hanging Long Enough, Colors, which would have been really nice to hear. I think it served the purpose. And what an absolute moneymaker too, right? Because he's playing these shows that he would have played anyway. He's getting tons of money from ticket sales. Then they just so happen to record a couple of them, put it on an album, and sell 9 million copies, or 9.5 million copies. And apparently, this was basically in and out of the charts for a really long time until his Greatest Hits album came out. Once his Greatest Hits album came out, that also included Both Sides of the Story and Dance into the Light, then I think it cannibalized this record. It made this record a little bit irrelevant. But for a really long time, this was his only Greatest Hits record. I think that's so interesting. And I think that's one of the reasons why Seconds Out is so popular as well, and was so popular for such a long time. Also, let's talk about just the crazy run that Phil had, that this was probably his peak. This album was probably his peak commercially, because look what we have. I mean, maybe We Can't Dance, probably We Can't Dance sold more than this, but like, look at these years. 89, But Seriously. 1990 was this album. 1991, correct me if I'm wrong here, by the way, you always do. 1991 was We Can't Dance, and 1992 was The Way We Walk shorts, which sold really well as well. So just an incredible run of like making tons of money and giving the fans tons of music. And that's when I was a little boy, really at the height of my Phil Collins fandom. And it was a great time to be alive. Okay, so should we go track by track? Let's go track by track. So this opens up with Something Happened on the Way to Heaven, which is actually not a huge moment in the overall set list. So on the album, it opens with Something Happened on the Way to Heaven, but Something Happened on the Way to Heaven is like in the middle of the set. And to me, it isn't as like big of an introduction as like Hanging Long Enough that happens right after Hand in Hand. So on the DVD and in the Berlin show and in most of the shows on that tour, Something Happened on the Way to Heaven came after That's Just the Way It Is and before Doesn't Anybody Stay Together Anymore. So just kind of like there in the set. But I mean, to me, it's the best opener for this record. I love that song. You know I love that song. And then number 2 is Against All Odds, which is similar to the set, because the actual set would go Hand in Hand, a big Hand in Hand version, which is so great. Hanging Long Enough, and then Against All Odds. I've talked about in this show how I got to ask Brad Cole about this one day, how bizarre it was that Phil would put Against All Odds always so early in the set, usually number 2. It's so bizarre. And so it's number 2 on here. Get it out of the way, I guess. And then it goes into Who Said I Would, which is really cool. Who Said I Would is a weird inclusion on this record because it wasn't a hit. It's a cool live performance, and it kind of, opened me up to that version. But I'm just surprised that was on, but something like I Wish It Would Rain Down wasn't on this record, or other things from But Seriously. Like maybe That's Just the Way It Is, or Find a Way to My Heart, or Hanging Long Enough. I'm just surprised why Who Said I Would ended up on the Greatest Hits package. Just kind of surprising. Inside Out too. That was a single. I don't think Who Said I Would was a single, was it? So I'm just surprised it's on here, but it's really good. It's a really good live song. One More Night. It's a bit of a slog, this record. I think that's the other thing too, when you put all the hits together, all like sporadic, as opposed to how it's on the DVD or on any bootleg of this set list, there's a little bit of a better natural flow. Whereas this is kind of like Who Said I Would into One More Night into Don't Lose My Number. That's just kind of same thing with Something Happened on the Way to Heaven, Against All Odds. Who Said I Would. So it's really kind of up and down, like the ballads are just thrown in. Same thing when you go, Don't Lose My Number, Do You Remember? That works well. Another Day in Paradise, and then Separate Lives. Separate Lives, oh, just so slow. That tune. That tune hurts me. It really hurts me. But it went to number one. So like, what's he going to do? He's got to play it. Don't Lose My Number is great. That's always been a big number, pun intended, at the shows. Do You Remember is the next track. I'm glad they included that on there because I really love Do You Remember? And I believe, we'll throw up a graphic now, but that was a single from this album, right? Yeah, I think that was a single. Was it? It was a single on But Seriously, I think, or maybe it was just a single for this. We'll have to find out, but it's a great song. One of my favorite Phil Collins songs. And I believe the live version was released as a single because I think there's a 12-inch or a 7-inch out there that I'd like to get. Another Day in Paradise, which would have been a huge, huge hit from that record. And then Separate Lives. How does that compare? That compares very, very similar. So it's essentially the same order. Who Said I Would on the DVD, then goes into Another Day in Paradise, and then into Separate Lives. Yeah, and then they do a bunch of other tunes before they get to In the Air Tonight. So it varies a little bit. So basically on this tour, In the Air Tonight was this dividing line. Deep cut Genesis pun there. So In the Air Tonight was this dividing line. And basically you had all of these like kind of interesting, exciting songs, some kind of more jammy songs like The West Side and Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and you had Colors and that kind of stuff. But then once we hit, and this happens on most of his shows, once we hit In the Air Tonight, even though that's a massive song and arguably his biggest song, he didn't save it for the end. He kind of uses it as an introduction into the hits. It's like, now we know we're going to get all of the big songs. And so we would get In the Air Tonight, and then we would get the band introductions, and then it would go into You Can't Hurry Love, and then You Can't Hurry Love, which is something I think he would go on and do forever, which was like, You Can't Hurry Love is kind of truncated into Two Hearts, which works really well. It's kind of cool. But now as a diehard fan, it's kind of predictable. But on this record here, it goes In the Air Tonight, You Can't Hurry Love, then into Two Hearts, and then into Sussudio, which is all kind of joined together, right? The drum machine starts for Sussudio right out of Two Hearts. It's just an incredible moment. And same thing on the DVD. After the band introductions, after In the Air Tonight, you have You Can't Hurry Love, Two Hearts, Sussudio. So massive hits, really upbeat tracks all played together, which is super cool. Great moment. Then it comes back down again for Groovy Kind of Love, which would have been a massive, massive hit. And then back up again for Easy Lover. Groovy Kind of Love went to number one. Two Hearts was nominated for an Oscar. So there's just enormous pressure to keep doing these songs. I've talked about that. I get it. It's no big deal. Then we go right in from Easy Lover into Take Me Home, which is and Take Me Home is really long and really cool moment. Do you remember where at the end of Take Me Home that the carousel flaps would close and then Phil would be on the outside of it and sometimes sit on the edge and walk around and say his goodbyes? That was incredible. What a way to kind of, the band could keep playing, but yet you separate the band from the superstar and he's the last person you see. I just think that was such an emotional ending to the show. One of the reasons why Phil didn't really get encores either, because the show ends with Take Me Home, right? Now, I didn't check this before, but he would end, am I wrong in saying that he would end the show at Sussudio and then kind of stimulate an encore from there? I think he would do that later on, but am I right in suggesting that he would kind of go off the stage, the carousel wouldn't close, the house lights wouldn't come on. There would be this that's where you would cheer him back on. He'd come back on straight up to the piano and do Groovy Kind of Love, and then Easy Lover, and then Take Me Home. So if I remember right, he kind of would force that encore to happen after Sussudio, but you'd never get him back after Take Me Home. Or did you? Did he ever come back and play a tune after Take Me Home? I don't think so. That'd be cool to see. What a great record. I mean, I think for a lot of us, it's nostalgic. I think because of the role that it played as a greatest hits package for a lot of, normal Phil Collins fans, not crazy Phil Collins fans that have their own YouTube channels, but just normal Phil Collins fans. Nerd. Respectable Phil Collins fans. This record is probably super important. It was probably the album that a lot of people would have in their collection. Maybe they wouldn't have the other records. Maybe they would just have But Seriously or they would just have this record. Maybe they just had this and Invisible Touch. You know what I mean? So it was kind of like in that late 80s, early 90s. This was like, if you had a hi-fi stereo in your living room, you probably owned a copy of this on CD. It was at not the height of CDs by any means, but the height of this cool new technology. And so people were picking up CDs, especially this record. It sounded really good. So tell me how this record is important to you. Is this important to you? Do you still listen to this today? Do you have a copy of the Live in Berlin on VHS or on CD? Were you at the show? I want to hear about, we'll do a video one day talking about all the tours, and maybe we'll focus specifically on this tour for a little bit. If you haven't heard the full show, either the audio from the Berlin show or the audio from any of the other tours or the rehearsals, you've got to check it out. Some really beautiful versions of Colors and Doesn't Anybody Stay Together Anymore and Inside Out. You've got to hear those tracks. But tell me what you think about Serious Hits Live. How did this album impact you and this tour? I'd love to know. Thanks for watching.